Well, good afternoon, everyone. We've got about 30 people joined already, close to 30. So I think most everyone's here. I think I had one or two people to recently email and say that they weren't going to be able to join us today. So welcome, 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 welcome. I'm Lakeisha Dunbar, transportation program planner. And we'll do more introductions in just a little bit. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We've got a PowerPoint presentation for a majority of this. And throughout the presentation, some of the staff will give you some directions on how we're going to participate throughout this process. Okay. I think I saw Mr. Butler has joined us.
Yeah, I am here.
Okay.
All set. Thanks, Lakeisha, and everybody for getting this meeting going. And thank you, everybody, for your participation. If you like biking or walking, which should be everybody here, I think we all like walking. We are humans after all. This is the place to be. We are excited to have you. We're excited to do this update. It's exciting for us because we've been working with this plan for a couple of years now, and it's a great plan. It's accomplishing a lot of good things. I see some familiar faces on here from our community advisory, the Better Street Safer City Advisory Board, and they've seen some things come to fruition that were put into this plan a few years back. So thank you again. Welcome. We're happy to have you all here. Appreciate your advice, participation as we go throughout this process. Lakeisha and Kim and Susan will talk more later, go into detail about what exactly is going to be expected of you and how you can contribute. But basically, we've got a great plan. And as it says in the plan, every once in a while, we want to update it. Still has a lot of projects in there that haven't been done, but we want to make some refinements and add a few additional projects. We always keep our ears to the ground, and every little thing we hear about how we can improve our bike and pedestrian system, we keep track of. So this is a good way for us to incorporate all that into the new plan or to the revised plan and get all of your feedback as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it back over to Lakeisha. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. At this time, we'll have Kim Cooper-Hart to come and give us a little bit of our introductions.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for being part of our Bike Walk OKC update. I wanted to make a point to thank our elected and appointed officials who are joining us on this team. Not everybody could make it today, but we have council members James Cooper, Jo Beth Hammond, and Mark Stonecipher as part of our advisory group. And from the Planning Commission, we have Scott Cravens and Asa Highsmith. Traffic and Transportation Commission, Rob Littlefield and JB Schuline. OKC Trails Advisory Committee, Hal McKnight. And from our Community and Neighborhood Enhancements and Advisory Board, Chris Dahlgren, who I see here. Thank you for coming. Next slide. We also have a huge component on our team here, which we're all part of this team that's doing this, of local partners and stakeholders. And some of the people here we see their names, but a lot of the folks that I didn't just call out by their titles with city commissions are affiliated with some of our best advocacy groups in the city for walking and biking. And here you have a list of those here. I see Cassie Poor here from the Alliance, a great city partner. And we have Anna from Neighborhood Alliance and a few other people that I recognize as well. So just thank you all again for giving your time to this process. And I also wanted everybody to see the breadth of expertise that we've got on the team. Next slide. For city staff, we have multiple departments involved in this, as you can imagine. Biking and walking affects our bus with COTPA, the Spokies program, and Parks and Recreation, obviously planning where our active transportation section lives, Public Works for traffic management and paving, and also our police department for the bike patrol. And I'd like to give a special thanks to Debbie Martin, Chief of Staff to City Council, for giving her time to be with us as well. Next slide. This is our planning staff that you see here today. Jeff is our fearless leader in the center, and all of us around are going to be helping Lakeisha and Max, who are the leads of this project. We're going to be helping them through this. And if you need anything from any of us at any time, please feel free to reach out. And thank you very much for coming with our short time today. I'm not going to go around and do introductions from everybody. We can see your face and your name. And if time allows, at the end of the meeting, maybe we can do that. But we want to kind of get through our material. And I think that's the end of what I have to say. And I think this moves on to the next section, right, Lakeisha?
Yes. Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody.
Now we'll have Susan Atkinson. She's going to provide us some house tips for a good meeting.
Greetings, everyone. Good to have you with us. Just want to remind us all, we're pretty used to this by now. Please mute your devices unless you're asking a question. And that can generally be found in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Next slide. We're going to have to punt a little bit today on questions. We're encountering some technical difficulties with the chat feature on our Zoom, on this particular Zoom account. So we're not going to be able to actually have typed chat questions, but what we would...
Susan, you suddenly got muted.
Sorry, that was me.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Somebody didn't like what you were saying, Susan.
Yeah, right. We have two options for you to give us some feedback today. One, you may email our colleague.
Oh, we got a problem again, Susan. Let me try and unmute you. I don't know if I can.
I think Mark has to unmute her.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
All right.
Nope, allowed to mute Susan.
Okay.
I'll try one more time. We're having some technical issues. Okay, I'm not muted. Good. All right. Two ways to give us feedback today. You can email Mark Collier. You see the address at the bottom of the screen. And that will keep a record of the questions. Also, there is a reactions tool. For some of you, it may be along the tool band at the bottom of the screen on the right that would allow you to raise your hand or give feedback. So instead of monitoring the chat, my job will be to monitor those of you who are raising your hand, and we'll probably try to work your questions in. We apologize. This just came up when we all joined the call. So we'll correct that by the time we meet again, but we will be able to preserve all the questions that you choose to email to Mark Collier. And if we aren't able to get you answers today, we will follow up with answers after the meeting. And lastly, I want to direct you to bikewalkokc.org. Some of you may be familiar with the existing document that we are working together to update. The screen is showing you what that web page looks like. It's a giant document, so we have it broken into manageable sizes. You don't have to download the entire thing. You can just view it if you choose. I would recommend that because the document is so large and dense. But you can follow along, or if you have specific questions regarding existing content, that's a good place that you can get, that you can start. So again, bikewalkokc.org.
Thank you, Susan. So are there any questions? This was you'll get used to seeing this. We're a little disappointed again. We're having some technical difficulties with our chat box, but we wanted to make sure that because it is a virtual setting, to give you opportunities to have questions and interact. And so you're going to see this slide come periodically throughout the presentation. So right now, are there any questions regarding the house tips and introductions or emails, how you can provide questions?
It looks like Sam Grimaldo has a question.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that website it says there's a 404 error. So I don't know if it's a hosting issue. With the case of me, I found the whole document in the email, so I can see it that way, but the website isn't working.
Thanks for that feedback, Sam. We'll look into that.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments at this time before we proceed? So today's agenda, today we will be meeting, our focus will be on the purpose for this update, the role of the advisory group, and we will cover some accomplishments since the adoption of the plan and outline for you the overall task associated with this update process. We will also discuss your first homework assignment and give a little tutorial associated with the homework. And yes, I said homework. You don't have to worry, it's nothing you will be graded on. In fact, you'll basically be grading staff on how well the current plan is written and helping us on how to make the plan better. So jumping right into the purpose for this update and the role of and your role in this process. This slide lists the overall task and goals for the update. The document itself is already a great plan, as Jeff mentioned earlier, and it works well for us and staff. It is very comprehensive, and it is useful for the city and has been very strategic with the funding sorry, let me take that back. It is useful. And the city has been very strategic with funding as well. And as a result, we've constructed a lot of projects and we've identified in the plan, and there are a lot of projects in the plan that are yet to be built. What I want to clarify is what this process is not. This process is not a plan redo, nor is it a comprehensive update. We are not rethinking the plan and its approach. The plan is less than 3 years old. It was adopted in 2018, so we are not ready to tear it apart and start all over. But this is really a chance to do some refinement of the current plan. And then the role of the advisory group. Really, before I go further, I want to thank you for agreeing to participate in this process. We know everybody's time is very valuable, and so we do really appreciate you taking the time to participate with and join us over the next couple of months as we go through this process. And we're excited that your participation, it will help to provide for a transparency of the process. And we look forward to you sharing your perspectives and guidance and ideas. So, are there any questions before we go forward? I'm sure. All right. See none. And before I turn it over to Max to do the plan overview, sorry, I'm reading my notes and I've already asked, are there any questions? And I'm going to turn it now over to Max, who's going to do our plan overview.
Hey, thanks, Lakeisha. My name is Max Harris, and I work for Lakeisha in transportation planning. And so I'm just going to do a quick overview. Like Lakeisha said, it's a really comprehensive plan covering a lot of stuff. So we're just kind of doing a high-level view right now, and then as we go through the process, we'll really dive into each part of it. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So just some of you may have been around for the first round of this in 2018 or so. But why the plan came to be, this plan was called for in Plan OKC. So the next slide. Plan OKC is the city's comprehensive plan, covering, you know, just a range of everything in the city. And so one of the components of that was a connectivity transportation chapter, and that called for a comprehensive bike and pedestrian plan. So that's why Bike Walk was created. And if you'll go to the next slide, please. Just going through some of the main goals of the plan. So I'm just going to go through there are 4 of them. One is that walking and cycling are safer in the city, is that we, you know, transform our city to, you know, piece by piece, make walking and cycling safer. So that's one. The next one is just to get more people walking and get more people biking. And for a variety of reasons laid out in the plan that, you know, starts to build a more walkable, bikeable city. So the third goal is connectivity. It's to try to connect residents to their, you know, their local jobs and transit stops and shops and schools and parks and everything around you. So trying to increase connectivity and accessibility. And the last one is barriers. So trying to address some of our major barriers like rivers and highways and things. So there is a bridge portion to the plan as well. So the next slide would be the plan organization. Just so how you can see how it's laid out, the plan is laid out. There are 4 chapters. The first chapter is introduction, just kind of goes through what we're doing and where we want to go. And then it goes through the public engagement process for the adoption of the plan. And then the second chapter is bike and trail planning. So looking at all on-street planned bike projects and multi-use trail network and you know, having a comprehensive network between the two. And it also goes through what a bike facility should look like. The third chapter is pedestrian planning, and so it goes through the whole analysis and all the proposals for pedestrian and sidewalk infrastructure. And then the fourth is implementation, so prioritizing all the projects and how to actually get the infrastructure on the ground. So next slide, please. So how do we use this plan? You know, a few different things. We use it to just queue projects, you know, prioritize projects that as the city gets funding through MAPS or another sales tax like Better Street, Safer City, or a bond program, that we have projects ready to go for those. And then we coordinate with our, you know, other departments, like especially Public Works, and coordinating. Sometimes they have their projects and we have ours, and we just want to really make sure we're in sync there. And sometimes opportunities arise and we can kind of take the opportunity to get some funding where we might otherwise not have thought we had it. So there's that, and then there's selecting projects for federal funding. So most of this is done through ACOG, Association of Central Oklahoma Governments, our metropolitan planning organization. And so we have this plan as our guide for everything, you know, we submit bike and pedestrian wise to federal grants. So the next slide, please. So in a nutshell, that's it, and we'll get into it more, like I mentioned earlier. But so we just covered the plan overview, you know, why we made the plan, what the goals are, how it's organized, and how it's used. So I think we'll stop here for any questions that anyone might have. Do you have anything, Susan?
All right, thank you, Max. So hearing crickets, we'll move right along. So Max just covered the plan overview, how the plan is organized. And so I will pick up with the status and accomplishment of the plan since the adoption. And so he just outlined for you how the plan is organized and all of the key components of the planning and prioritization are kind of the first two steps of the plan. And I'm going to pick up with what we have accomplished as it relates to funding, design, and implementation steps of the plan. As I previously mentioned, the city has been very strategic in identifying and allocating funding for bicycle trails and sidewalk projects, which started well before the adoption of the plan. So we started allocating funding for trails and sidewalks and for bicycle facilities well before 2018. So in the last 8 to 9 years, over $300 million have been allocated for these 4 categories: bikes, sidewalks, street enhancements, and trails. Of that $300 million is included $83 million from the MAPS 4 initiative, which was approved in 2019. And of that $83 million, the allocations are $20 million for bike projects, $55 million for sidewalks and amenities, and $8 million for trails. And this is a breakdown of how the $300 million is allocated by project type. And I include street enhancements in this categories in this list of projects because typically our street enhancement projects include significant sidewalk and pedestrian improvements. We get a lot of sidewalks and some pedestrian ADA improvements when we do our street enhancement projects. And then the planning department staff is currently managing or monitoring close to 125 projects. And that list is going to grow as we continue this process, and as we continue the conversation for identifying projects for MAPS 4. And eventually, believe it or not, we'll start getting ready for the 2027 bond. So this list of projects is going to grow. Another accomplishment that we've obtained in the last 2 years is the publishing of our bike design standards. This was a coordinated effort between planning staff, public works staff, and with participation from consultants. It's a 9-page document and it's available online and it details items such as spacing for conflict green paint, spacing and specifications for delineators, spacing on bike boxes, sharrows, and widths for bike lanes and bike buffers. The standards are made available for engineers and consultants, and they use these to develop the construction plans and to calculate project budgets and estimates for our funded projects. And a copy of the link for these standards will be provided in our as part of our plan update web page and resources to come. And then here I have an example of the list of prioritized bike projects, and this is found on page 112 in chapter 4. The implementation chapter of the plan has a list of bike, sidewalk, and trail projects. Staff references these pages constantly as our checklist of projects to be funded and constructed. What you see here you won't see in the plan is that we have included check marks on these pages to identify projects that have received full funding and are either under design or construction. We included these strictly for the purposes of this meeting. So this is just an example of one page, but we will also be providing to you a link to a resource that will identify all of the projects that currently have funding and are under design or construction. And then the ones that have the word partial in the box means that they were partially funded at the time of the development of the plan, or subsequent to the plan. So I think you could see under table 4.3 priority number 10, where the partial is a different font. That was added recently after the adoption of the plan, so that you know that that project is currently partially funded. The plan identifies over 230 miles of planned on-street bike facilities. And since the adoption of the plan, we have funded over close to 79 miles of the 230 miles for on-street bike facilities. And then the plan also identifies over 198 miles of planned trail and have since funded about 15 miles of trail. And similar to the bike funded project list, this is an example of the sidewalk prioritized list of projects. This is specifically for the pedestrian priority areas, the PPAs. You're going to hear us reference that quite a bit throughout the process. PPA stands for pedestrian priority areas. This is page 121 of chapter 4. And again, what you see here, but will not see in the plan, is that we have included check marks to identify projects that have received full funding and are either under design or construction. We've also included additional text to identify the funding source. And so, of course, BOND stands for 2017 bonds, and SDBG stands for Surface Transportation Block Grant. And that's a federal funding that we typically apply for, and it's competitive funding that we apply for and receive through ACOG. And so total funded sidewalk that we have so far is about 130 miles of sidewalk that we have funded to date. And that includes things that are either constructed, currently under design. And you may ask why I don't say how many planned miles of sidewalk like I did for the bike and trail projects. Only the PPAs, only the pedestrian priority areas in the plan and the downtown area in the plan do we propose exactly where we desire to install sidewalk. However, for the schools, transit, and parks areas or park categories, we haven't identified the exact location for sidewalks. So we don't know the mileage associated with those projects that get funded. Once those areas are allocated funding, staff then does some field verification to determine exactly where to install sidewalks. So we couldn't tell you up front right now how many miles of planned sidewalk we have. We could make some estimates maybe based on funding, but not based on actually what we have identified in the plan. So what I've just covered is the accomplishment, some of the accomplishments that we've achieved since the adoption of the plan as it relates to funding, design, and our prioritized list. Before I move on, are there any questions before I turn it over to Max?
Lakeisha, I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Okay, thank you, Susan. So Max is going to introduce to you the task associated with what we want to accomplish with this update.
All right, so this is basically just going to cover everything that we need to do, both on the staff side and on the advisory group side, and both together of everything we need to accomplish by the end of this. So if you'll go to the next slide, please. So this is more on the staff side. Technical edits is what we're calling this, and everything from maps like these, just simple like current initiatives in 2018 when the plan was adopted are no longer, a lot of them are built now and we have new projects. So just updating maps like that to show current, things that are going on. And then collision data too. We have collisions for both pedestrians and another one for bike. And so you can see the date range is 2003 to 2015. So just getting the most up-to-date numbers we have, and then converting that to maps as well. So there's a lot of technical edits like that need to be made throughout the plan. And so we get a lot of resident requests, mostly for sidewalks, some for bikes. And then we also get our council members that have recommendations and requests for us, and appointed officials too. So we have a database of all of these requests. We document them all, and you know, in one way or another, we need to look at all of these and consider them for the plan update. So you know, we're maybe map them out or something, and kind of see where they fall. And so yeah, we need to address all those requests as a task. So the next one, please. The next slide, please. So this is a major thing we need to do for pedestrian infrastructure, and that is to look at our pedestrian priority areas, or PPAs we call them. And it's something that we as a group can really dive into and get detailed on where within or around these areas we want to see new sidewalks. You know, so these are sort of, I'll go through this in a little bit, how we got to these, but these pedestrian priority areas are laid out in the plan. A lot of the projects are funded through sales tax and bond already, but there are ones that are not funded, and then we kind of want to know where we want to go from there once they all get funded. So we'll really dive into pedestrian priority areas. So next is, so outside of pedestrian priority areas, the PPAs, we have additional priority areas. And this is what Lakeisha was kind of referring to earlier, where we don't have specific streets necessarily for these projects, but we know that we want sidewalks around school locations, park locations, and major transit stop areas. So we've prioritized those schools and parks and transit, and you know, and again, I'll go through how we got those, but you know, the ones that need sidewalks most, basically. And so yeah, so we'll go through that methodology, and we'll kind of look at that as a group as well, and see if there's anything we want to change with that. So next slide, please. Okay, yeah, so this is what I got a little ahead of myself. So yeah, we'll look at the methodology and the prioritization process for those, and for pretty much everything in the plan as well. So the next slide, please. So similarly to pedestrians, we'll also really get into bike and trail projects. So the plan proposes a network. It proposes these different tiers, which are laid out in the plan of how protected, you know, the facility can or needs to be. And so we'll really, you know, we'll get into that as part of this process too, and you know, just see if all of these, you know, or see what might need to change, or what additions we really think need to be made, or what have you. So bike and trail projects together we'll look at. And then we kind of wanted to introduce a kind of a new component. And so this is looking at corridors and safe crossings, and specifically corridors that may not be in the plan, but we know are important in some way. They're really dangerous or something, and they really need projects, but they weren't really addressed in the plan. So looking at major corridors like that, and then areas also where we want to kind of point out, identify key areas that need a safe crossing. So this is a lot of you might be familiar with Uptown, and there was a safe crossing put in here that is just strictly for pedestrians to cross back and forth safely. So, so we'll be looking at that as a kind of a new component. And then this is kind of the last chapter. The action plan and implementation plan is, you know, maybe not specifically sidewalk and bike projects, but it's sort of taking a step back and looking at some general things we can do besides just capital improvement projects, just to make OKC more walkable, bikeable. So yeah, looking at some code changes, policy changes, and things like that. So to kind of lay this all out in a sequence here, we will look at all things pedestrian first. So that'll be step one. We'll get into that, you know, towards the end of the presentation here to kind of prep us for the next meeting. But that next meeting will be pretty much all pedestrian. So we'll really dive into that. And then after that, step two, we'll look at all things bike and trail planning. And then step three is where we kind of take a step back and we look at the implementation and action plan. So this is a good point, a good place to ask for questions again. And again, so to summarize, so we have technical edits, a bunch of requests from citizens and council, additions to PPAs, bike trail project adjustments, corridor and safe crossings component, and implementation action plan. So Susan, do we have any questions?
Yes, Tony Carfang has a question.
Yeah, just in terms of the technical edits or the PPA updates, do you anticipate, say, rescoring some of those PPAs based on the Pathways to Greatness impact on school consolidations?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We kind of had to go on the fly a little bit as we started funding some of these school sidewalk projects for, well, as you know, the Community and Neighborhood Enhancement Advisory Board for the sales tax projects, because some of them, you know, closed. And so what we did then was we just, you know, took out the schools from the list that closed and went to the one that was next that they closed. So we would either do something like that, or we might even look at, I think it's all kind of up in the air. We can look at reprioritizing them or making slight tweaks to that prioritization process as well. So.
Okay, thank you.
Max, I'm not seeing any other questions.
Okay, great. Well, I will turn it back over to Lakeisha.
Oh, sorry. Sam, did you have a question?
Yeah, it might get addressed later, but when it comes to PPAs and what you're wanting as far as community input from the advisors, are you looking for, can we add ideas like, you know, I know the focus is sidewalks and corridor planning, but things like, you know, benches or ensuring that there's shade along certain parts of a pedestrian corridor. Are things like that things we should be thinking of as well?
Well, we haven't formally called those out in the plan before. And I see Mr. Butler's opened his video, so I don't know if he wanted to respond to that question. Go ahead, Jeff.
No, go ahead, Lakeisha.
Okay. I just was going to say we hadn't called out those components in the current plan, but we'll definitely look at it. Maybe we can look at it if it's like a corridor, or maybe we want to identify special treatment to the corridor. We can discuss that and see how we can add that as a component to the plan. We can discuss that. And yes, I'll give you, as part of the homework, we'll talk about what it is we'll be asking for specifically as it relates to the PPAs.
I was going to say that is a good question, good suggestion, especially in light of the fact that the maps 4, you know, it does talk about, you know, providing some amenities along some of these corridors. So yeah, good comment, good thing to look into.
Are there any other questions at this time before we move on to step 1? And again, specifically related to what we just covered, which is kind of the task assigned with this process. Any other questions? Okay, good stuff. So I'm going to pick up here, and again, Max just covered the 3 steps of the plan update, and we're going to jump right in today and get you ready with participating in step number 1. And I mentioned earlier that you were going to get some homework, and by the way, it was brought to my attention that this is not intended to be a 101, a class 101 course. This is more like a graduate level course where you will do a little review, but we will do a little review, but some of this will have to be some take-home review and some take-home work. And so with that, your first assignment is to get acquainted with chapters 3 and 4 of the plan. Chapter 3 describes the prioritization process, and it breaks it down into the different area types. So the prioritization process for the PPAs, for the downtown areas, for the schools, parks, and transit. And it also includes bike and trail in there. But right now we're just focusing on the pedestrian components of the plan. And then we're going to pick up with the bike and trails in the next couple of meetings. Chapter 4 displays the outcome of the prioritization process. And it results in the comprehensive list of the project priorities. And so for the step 1, when you review these chapters, one of your primary focuses, again, is going to be on specifically on the pedestrian priority areas. This is a topic for your first homework assignment. And I will explain in just a few minutes what you will be asked to do, specifically what I think kind of along the lines of what Sam was asking. Max is going to give you some more background information related to the components of each of these sections, but he'll cover that after I kind of talk through what the homework is. Again, as you are getting acquainted with the PPAs, we still want you to get familiarized with the other priority areas. We know that some of you may have some special or direct interest, maybe either in the downtown area or the transit areas, or schools or even parks. So these are the pages that if you have a special interest related to the downtown area, these are the pages that you might want to focus on for the downtown area. We also have the transit areas. Again, these are the pages that you might want to focus on if you're only really interested in the transit areas. These are the pages related for the school areas and then the park areas. And again, you should have gotten a copy of this presentation, so you should have reference to these pages. If you still need to get copies of this, just reach out to us and let us know. We can get you this information. So in addition to getting acquainted with chapters 3 and 4, we would like for you to start working on making recommendations for the PPA areas. Within the week, you will receive an email with the homework details and resources. But essentially, we're asking you to review the pedestrian priority area boundaries. So we want you to start looking at the boundaries, and we're going to provide you maps of each of the priority areas. And I'll show you an example in just a minute. And when you look at those priority areas, we want you to start making recommendations on if there needs to be any changes to the boundaries. Do we need to add sidewalk projects within the boundaries? And do we need to create any new pedestrian priority areas? So we've got 10 right now, and Max is going to describe how we came up with those 10 in just a few minutes. But maybe you want to look at the overall city map and how those are laid out, and maybe you might want to make some recommendations on some additional priority areas. We would also like for you to start thinking about defining key pedestrian corridors. So Max mentioned earlier that one of our tasks is defining pedestrian corridors, maybe adding that as a component to the plan. and looking at locations where we need to focus on improving safe pedestrian crossings. So typically we think of pedestrian crossings, we've identified, I think the plan does a good job of identifying intersections that need to have a focus for safe pedestrian crossings. So maybe these crossings might be mid-block crossings, or crossings, of course, that just aren't at intersections. So you might want to start looking at that, and it could be either associated with priority areas or just the general areas throughout the city. We've also like to establish a homework deadline. We're looking at Wednesday, February 3rd is a goal to receive your information back. And so that we could have a little time to process the information, and we'd like to be able to report back to you all at the February 10th meeting on the information that we received. If you can't make that deadline, of course, still feel free to continue to send us information. We'll continue to collect information throughout the process of this plan update. We just set that date so that we could have it available and be able to report back to you all at the February 10th meeting on what we might have collected by that date. And then some of what we are asking you to look at may have already been provided as part of either some of those requests that Max mentioned earlier. We receive requests on a weekly basis, and so council members have submitted requests, and of course lots of citizen requests. So again, feel free to resubmit them if you've already submitted something, if you didn't remember submitting something in the past, but we'll identify where we have duplication. And this slide here is just an example of what you will receive as part of your homework. And so what I described earlier, this is an example of the class and area priority PPA, pedestrian priority area. And it has the boundary of the priority area. The darker lines within the boundary are existing sidewalks, where existing sidewalks are. And then the red and green represent the phase 1 and phase 2 sidewalks. And Max is going to explain a little bit the difference between phase 1 and phase 2. So what we'll be doing is providing you a map like this for each of the 10 existing priority areas. And we would like you to look at the boundaries, consider if we need to move or change any of the boundaries, and then identify any new projects that we may want to add to the pedestrian priorities areas. Are there any questions? Okay, I don't see any hands raised. This is great. And so I will turn it over to Max, and he's going to do a little pedestrian priority prioritization tutorial. He's going to do a quick overview of how the PPA sidewalk projects got prioritized.
Okay, thanks, Lakeisha. So in order to do the homework, we thought it would be good to go through really how we came up with with these areas and with prioritizing these projects and selecting these projects too. So just from a high level view, we wanted to look at these 6 things. So one is, response population, who needs sidewalks the most and who needs to benefit from them. Connectivity to schools, land uses like schools and parks, and to existing networks. So if there's sidewalks, or areas that have some sidewalk infrastructure, but there are a lot of gaps, connectivity to existing, neighborhood revitalization. So neighborhoods that are being revitalized in various forms, especially around the core, around the city, kind of complementing that. Urban commercial districts, so again, getting people to nearby shops, and commercial district areas that are revitalizing. So, and we do our own field assessments too. So we do pedestrian survey tools and site assessments, things like that. So if you can go to the next slide, please. You'll just see this is what we have in place, existing facilities. Comes from aerial data that is able, through LiDAR and other technologies, is able to differentiate sidewalk pavement from other pavement. So you can just see, just in general, where we have sidewalk infrastructure and where it's lacking. And so that we call that the donut effect, kind of in the middle. And this just kind of illustrates the early development of Oklahoma City and how sidewalks were a common thing. The sort of post-World War II era of not building sidewalks with new developments are represented by the donut. And then, as we get to third and fourth ring suburbs, the city, that was around the time where the city required new developments to have sidewalks. So it gives you a good idea. But we also know some other things we can infer, like the cities and the sidewalks in the core are older sidewalks, WPA era, a lot of them. So, and then there are certainly needs in the third and fourth ring suburbs as well. So we don't want to discount those. And just to kind of give us an idea of what we're working with. And so from there, we started our analysis. And so the pedestrian prioritizing pedestrian projects, this analysis is pretty detailed. And so I would refer these pages 83 through 89 if you really want to get into it and read what the process was. But in general, we did 3 major sort of GIS data analyses. And so one of them was pedestrian level of service, and it looked at every city-owned street in the city and looked at a lot of different attributes of every street, like are there sidewalks? It looked at speed, it looked at number of traffic lanes to get like, is this good pedestrian service or not? So it was that, and then it was intersection analysis that looked at a similar attributes for each intersection, every intersection in the city, and also in the intersection analysis is where collisions, was there a pedestrian collision involved, at some point. So there are a lot of different things we look at for those two, and then we also looked at pedestrian demand. So that was kind of a land use. Proximity or how many parks and schools and bus stops and government facilities and healthcare facilities and grocery stores and stuff are in or within a certain distance of intersections. That's the pedestrian demand map. All those 3 put together were generalized in this raster heat map. And then once that was made, it was kind of balanced through a demographics, looking at demographics. So it's a lot of census data. So if you go to the next slide, it'll show some of those responsive populations. That's how so looking at the heat map and then balancing that with responsive populations. And specifically, things like, are there low-income households, is there a lot of low-income households? Is there a higher population of those without access to a vehicle? Is this a high population of people who may have a disability of some sort? And then we looked at historically underserved populations too. So that's kind of the general way that pedestrian priority areas were created. And just saying that too, you can kind of infer that there is some level of subjectivity to that. So that makes it a really good thing for the group to look at and see where we can make some expansions in the boundaries or additional projects within some of the areas, or like Lakeisha mentioned, maybe a new pedestrian priority area or multiple new ones. So it's kind of up in the air for us to, we're open to new ideas and things like that. The next slide is going into each pedestrian priority area. So like I mentioned, we looked at land uses and making sure that what's the best way for people to get connected to destinations, local destinations like schools and parks, and local commercial districts and things like that. And then again, your response populations there to the side. But selecting which streets we need to put sidewalks on first, because we know we won't have the resources to do just every street. So which ones are the most important, and then which ones are the most important after that is where we came up with the phase 1 and phase 2. So yeah, thank you. So the phase 1 projects are, as you can kind of intuitive, is major roads. You think of a road like May Avenue or something like that, where it's like, okay, that's a dangerous, that needs sidewalks before like a neighborhood road probably. So that's kind of the thinking behind that. And then looking at roads that have transit routes, obviously are going to rise to the top too. And then again, that pedestrian generating land uses. So are there a lot of land uses? Are there a lot of destinations, shops and things like that? And schools and other things. So this is a bit of an animation, so bear with me, Lakeisha. So yeah, the phase 1 is sort of your major arterial roads, and then generally the phase 2 is just the roads that best connect to those phase 1 roads, and that's a little subjectivity again. So maybe those roads have more more like land use, like schools and stuff, that we would want to pick those roads over other roads, things like that. So the next slide is how this culminates in the PPAs. And so now we're looking at chapter 4, and this is all these are laid out in the plan on pages 120 through 133. So it shows these pages show each priority area and all the phase 1 projects on each priority area. So to go through the Classroom 23rd one, and then the Capitol Hill one, and then the other 8 on the next pages. And then it'll go to phase 2 projects. So just a note, when you're looking at these and thinking some of this through, at first you might be just looking at phase 1 and you might have other ideas, but make sure you check phase 2 first, because it might, you might see a street that you thought, oh, okay, well, actually we got that covered. So what else do I need to look at? So I think that is, okay, yeah. So this is all projects put together. This is all pedestrian projects that Bikewalk OKC proposes. So in, around where the red in the heat map will be are the 10 hatched orange priority areas. And then you can see the downtown area as well. But then, all the transit priority areas, the areas of high transit ridership and things like that, and then the schools and parks as well. So the schools and parks and transit all have their own prioritization processes. And, but, you can see that, like, at least, or that the whole city is kind of encompassed in at some level. So I think that's all I have. And then I'll turn it over to questions.
Before we go to questions, I wanted to clarify something here. I think I meant to mention this earlier, and I thought about it as Max was going through these slides here, particularly when we look at the phase 1 and the phase 2 pedestrian priority maps. When you see these maps here, the color coding, I want to explain the color coding. So I showed you earlier for the homework, the map that you're going to get has the red and green, and that just signifies kind of the analysis process that we went through to identify the phase 1 and phase 2 projects. process that Max just described. Once we identify the phase 1 and phase 2 projects, we then kind of grouped those segments of sidewalks within the PPAs into individual little projects based on their proximity. So what these colors that you see here, like under Class and Boulevard, number 1, and there's like a pink or fuchsia colored one, that represents one project. So that when we got funding, we identified, particularly like in the bond proposition, that number 1 is the description of one funded project. So just for clarification there, if you might be wondering, well, why all of these colors? What do these colors represent? And especially when you get the homework map where it's going to be red and green, there's no association whatsoever between the red and green lines you're going to see in your homework maps and then these multicolored maps that are in the plan. All right. So with that, are there any questions on what we just covered? Okay. I see a hand raised, a couple of hands raised. I'll call, I think the first one I saw was Mr. Carfang.
So with regard to the separation of projects, I think I've heard that there's a bit of a challenge administrative overhead wise that with sidewalks and bike lanes as opposed to highways, there's just a lot more overhead to manage different projects, or the sheer quantity of the 125 some odd projects. Out of curiosity, how did you arrive at just how much budget to break down to a particular project?
Let's see. I think there's a variety of ways that we come up with that, and it's based on the funding allocation. So like the Better Street, Safer City process. Well, I think what happened first, and sorry, I have to speculate on what happened because I didn't start participating with the plan until after it was adopted, and late in the middle of 2018. So the bond funds identified, the projects were identified, and with the PPAs, because we've identified the road segments, we typically identify the estimates, the budgets based on the mileage. And at the time, it started out at $65 a linear foot. That was an estimate that Public Works was using. That number has grown substantially over the past couple of years. And we're somewhere between $85 to $90 a linear foot. And that's based on the location. Things like driveways have a huge impact on the cost for sidewalks. So if we're doing sidewalks in a neighborhood, where there are lots of driveways, that has a huge impact on the cost estimates for projects. So that's how I believe the bond projects were estimated. And you said by category, is that your question, or by project?
A little bit more, for instance, in terms of, say, looking at that Northwest Classen Boulevard at 23rd, with 5 different color codes here. If throwing out numbers here, if all of those 5 projects total about $30 million, why would it make sense to break them up into 5 independent contracting efforts as opposed to one much larger contracting effort?
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. Really, it's opportunity. It's kind of a combination of the two. What opportunities we have as far as what we're allocating for funding, what funding we're allocating, and I'll let Jeff jump in here.
Yeah, Tony, that's a great question. And I think we want to talk to Public Works about that. My recollection when we were putting together the bond was that they like to have, for whatever reason, they like to have moderately sized projects in terms of dollar amount. But yeah, I mean, it's a valid question. We can certainly talk to them and say, hey, what is the ideal size of project? And honestly, sometimes bigger projects allow us to get better opportunities for, federal matching funds, for example. So that is something that we'd like to look at and kind of optimize that for efficiency's sake. But in any case, regardless of how big the project is, it always comes down to design, and we've got to do the best we can on the front end, in the planning process to we're not going to do the survey and all the nitty gritty detail, but we are going to look at traffic counts, at right-of-way widths, and all the data we can pull to determine the feasibility of a project. So no matter how you slice it, there's a lot of work and administration in planning, designing, and building these projects.
Another thing I'd like to add too is, again, for one observation is based on the funding type. For example, that SDBG funding that I mentioned earlier, which is a federal funding, there's a specific requirement criteria related to that funding source that the projects have to be on federally functionally classified roads. And so that may discount quite a few, like our neighborhood roads. And so where the plan may have already identified maybe that yellow section of projects, some of it might be on a major arterial, and adjacent to it might be a neighborhood road. And if we submitted that project, it might score well based on the SDBG criteria, but only the portions that are on a major arterial would get funded through that process. So that's just an example of another reason why you might see we might do a portion of a project rather than the whole thing or the whole PPA. So that's just another example. Maybe that helps answer your question.
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
I might add one thing, and I'll make it quick because I see the time, but can you go back a couple slides?
Okay, and just to let you know, we're at the wrap up. We're good. I think this is really we'll talk about our timeline. So this is a perfect time to start asking your questions. Go ahead, Max.
So yeah, so on this, I mean, it's a good question to say, why not just do that first one as just all one project? And I think I wasn't, like Lakeisha, we both kind of inherited these. But I think that breaking them up like this allowed us to make sure that all 10 PPAs were going to get, their top projects done. The road's most important to all PPAs. So breaking it up, like number one in red is Class and Boulevard and the immediate roads. And then in Capitol Hill, number one is the red there. So if you were to fund all Classen, then you may not have enough funding for all projects and all PPAs, I think is kind of the thinking there. So it had to be broken up in some way or another. And, there's debate of whether that was the best, way to break it up. But I think that's probably the thinking and why it was broken up. Make sure we get the top projects in all PPAs funded.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thanks.
Looks like Lakeisha Ryan Fogel has his hand raised.
Okay.
Hey guys, I had a question about the implementation and action plan, I guess, for Bike Walk OKC in general. I heard some stories about, I guess, just an example, the 39th Street District was supposed to get Tier 1 bike infrastructure. And I believe there was a meeting with some of the property owners, and then it just kind of went to Tier 3 or tier nothing. I guess, how do you guys implement, and is Bike Walk OKC like just a suggestion, or is it legit?
The short answer to your question is it's not a suggestion. It is, I think every project is a proposed project. It's a proposed planned project. I know there are others who may want to interject here, but the example, I might let Kim talk about the 39th Street example, but I think one thing we do need to be reminded of is we did do a full public engagement process with the adoption of the plan. I think those of us who've done planning are experienced that there are always still people who may not have really got to participate in the process or weren't aware. And so when we start implementing projects, they may not be on board or in favor of the project. So we still have to coordinate with the public, and sometimes we don't get everything that we propose. I'm going to turn it over to Kim and then Jeff. I think they want to like to comment on that.
Hi, Ryan. This is Kim Cooperhart. Specifically on 39th Street, and this will be true with a lot of street enhancement projects. Once we get on the field and we look at property owner needs for parking, and we look at the traffic volumes, we look at driveway access, some of the tier recommendations that were maybe a little theoretical in the beginning, once we field test those, we look at what's actually feasible and what's going to work. In an entertainment district, to have fully protected bike lanes and maybe delineators and so forth, it really didn't make a lot of sense with all the driveway issues. There's a lot of driveways on 39th Street and a lot of parking needs. So what we were able to do in working with the councilman and the property owners, this is like the implementation piece where it gets to be a little bit more of an art than a science, is to work out a really good happy medium that met everybody's needs and still positions 39th Street as a great connector for the rest of the bike route. So the bike facilities didn't go away on 39th Street. They just weren't as intense as were originally envisioned in the plan. I don't know if that answers your question or even completely satisfies what you wanted to hear, but that's how we got to where we got.
And Kim, I'll just add to that. 39th is a great example of how the plan is supposed to work. It's called for in the plan, it calls for a tier 2 facility, which is a bike lane, a lot like you see downtown here. But the plan makes clear, and the way we've always treated it is, this is a plan, it's not a design. So like Kim was talking about, when you actually get to the nitty gritty and you're talking about, you know, the design from this curve to this curve, or even in the case of 39th, we're talking the streetscape, we're talking about just a few blocks. And what should we do with this street between the front of the building over here and the front of the building over here, or, you know, the right of way that we have. And, you know, it's complicated because everybody who uses that, whether that be the business owners, the pedestrians, the bicyclists, the automobile drivers, customers that are visiting there from all over the place, all have different priorities. And, you know, there are safety issues. You know, how much space do we need for the sidewalk? How much space do we need for amenities? I mean, the list is endless. And so that's why we leave flexibility in the plan to do things like this. So when you look at a corridor in Bike Walk OKC, and the corridor like this says, you know, a tier 2, the 39th, it's several blocks long, all the way from Walker, all the way over to the freeway. And a lot of that stretch, in fact, we've talked recently with Councilman Cooper about having a lot of that stretch, you know, just be as planned. You know, once we get funding, we can go ahead and install a bike lane on 39th east of the district that we're working in now. But, you know, we wanted to have flexibility in case something just, you know, you never know until you get in there, because it's a game of inches, literally. And so we sometimes need the flexibility to go down to you know, a tier 3 facility for a few blocks, because right of way varies, you know, the land uses vary, curb to curb varies, and we would have never gotten this plan done if we had to literally design it all. So hopefully that helps too. And I think it's worked well. That has worked well. Another example is Walker, from downtown all the way down to where's the terminus of the Walker? It's at the trail, basically. That was a good example of, in the plan, it shows Walker's going as being a bike facility further south. But when we took a close look at the traffic counts and when we really studied it, we felt like it's probably best to terminate it at the trail. That's a sensible connection. And the traffic counts were just a little too high in people's, and just out of some people's comfort zone. So those decisions are important to be flexible on a little bit, and they get really finalized in the design phase.
Lakeisha, Councilmember Cooper has his hand raised.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cooper.
Hi, everyone. So I'd like to speak very directly to the 39th Street question, which I think is a great question that Ryan has asked. And I'll just kind of walk people through a couple items on that. One, Bike Walk called for precisely that level of bike infrastructure. And not everyone over in the district was on board with it. And I advocated quite strongly, in fact, that, the way that Ryan articulated that question, like, we have this document and, how legitimate is it ultimately? And so I feel very strongly about Bike Walk OKC. Worked with Councilwoman Hammond and Tony Carfang and Chris Dahlgren and Lakeisha and Maxton and Shane Hampton to craft the maps for sidewalk and bike plan. And we specifically used Bike Walk OKC as our guide for maps for. So yeah, I think that is a good question that Ryan asked. To walk everyone back through the end of the 39th Street process, it really came down to two final possibilities there, because there was a pushback, as I said, from some members of that board and property owners over there in terms of the bike infrastructure. And for those of you who've heard me speak before about my own family's background, my father passed away basically because of alcoholism. So I really take very seriously the idea that when someone goes to a bar, that maybe being in a car is not the safest thing. And so that's one of the other reasons why I advocated very, very strongly for bike infrastructure. And ultimately, what that left us with was two final possibilities then. One was, what about a multi-use facility like the wide sidewalks that 39th Street is now going to see? There was talk of whether or not that could be a shared pedestrian and bike approach. And then there was the one that we ultimately settled on, which is, and for those of you who've seen me post back in December, which was one of the last social media posts I did before my now month-long break from social media, the idea was, okay, well, 39th Street, let's do wide sidewalks for pedestrians and patio space. And let's do something only Automobile Alley had done in our city, but is a trend of best practice when it relates to planning, as many of the people on this call knows, which is reverse angle parking. And that was something that I specifically, as the council person, presented to the board in their final deliberations. I presented those two options. They already knew where I stood, but here were the two compromise ideas. And then I had to go and teach, and I left the board to deliberate. And within about an hour or so, the wonderful Kim Cooperhart sent me a text and maybe even a voicemail saying that they had chose the reverse angle parking, and my heart almost beat out of my chest, because what that's going to do, for those of you who are aware of what reverse angle parking is, right, is it's going to allow for people to reverse their car into a parking space along 39th, so that when they are leaving 39th, their car is facing the street where that Shero for bikes will be, which now makes it a safer bike route for someone on a bike, and safer for the person in the car as well. And I was delighted that the board went that direction. But I just need everyone to know there was a debate. It was a very vigorous debate, and I really applaud Kim and Jeff for kind of getting us to that final moment where we had those two options there that we were able to present to the board, and the board came along for the ride on that one. And so I'm glad that they did. And I think that's been, not just with 39th Street, but it's kind of been a bit of the heartburn for me since I took office was, there's another area I could talk to you about where sidewalks were supposed to go in. And one of the neighbors just, my tree, and did a petition and put an end to it. And I don't like that, but that is what they did. So this is really why I'm excited about this group, because it's important that you all lend your voice to this process as well, because quite frankly, and I'm not saying anything that a lot of you don't already know in your hearts already, the culture of the car has taken root here for decades. And you heard Maxton talk about that donut hole. And there are just a lot of people, unfortunately, still in the city who do not understand or care to understand the significance of walkability and connecting people to education, recreation, and employment. And same when it comes to transit, and same when it comes to bike infrastructure. But I would suggest that whether it's Better Streets, Safer City, MAPS 4, or the very fact that all of you are participating in this this revision, I think that there's enough of us who are who get it and are moving in the right direction. And I think enough of those people spoke in 2019 when they elected Councilwoman Hammond and myself. So I really appreciate Ryan's question. And again, I also really appreciate the work that Kim and Jeff did to kind of help us navigate a very difficult conversation. And I'm glad that the board came along for the ride, and so did everyone else. So thanks for allowing me to speak on that.
Lakeisha, Josh Vaught has raised his hand.
I'd just like to follow that up real quick. I want to say thanks for your responses. I know you guys have put a lot of hard work into this stuff, and it's just got to be frustrating for you to do all that work and not to see it implemented, I guess. But anyway, thank you for the response.
Well, thank you, Josh, for the comment. I want to get us, we've got just a couple minutes left in the meeting. We are at the end of the presentations. We're at the wrap up. I'm going to just review the timeline, and then whatever time we have left is going to be open for comments and additional questions. And so again, this overall timeline process timeline is it's going to take a couple of months. We tried to minimize the number of meetings, however. So we're looking at a total right now 4 meetings. And so our next meeting is scheduled for February 10th. And as Max mentioned, we're starting our focus on the pedestrian element. and given time, we'll pick up with where we left off with our homework, kind of report back on conversations associated with the pedestrian element, and then we'll start talking about bike and trails, probably kind of as the second half of that meeting. And then we'll take a break through the month of March. That'll give us some time, staff, some time to process the information that we've received so far and actually do some technical edits to the plan. And then we'll pick up again in April, planning for April 14th. And that meeting will hopefully wrap up any conversations associated with bike and trails. And then we'll talk about the implementation and action portions of the plan, just a couple of sections there. We are looking to do some public engagement, really probably just maybe do a website where we can open it up to the public, advertise to the public, what we have so far, draft, maybe ask them some very detailed, specific questions, kind of maybe some of similar things that we're asking you. And then we'll go through the document, draft document, start reviewing the draft document. And that's probably mostly internal review of course, with the advisory group and then internal staff and city departments. We'll come back in August together, and hopefully at that time we'll kind of go through, present to you the technical edits and the recommendations that we've received and how they've been implemented into the plan. And then we'll look to start adoption of the plan in August and September. It'll go before the Planning Commission and then before Council. Are there any questions about the timeline? And we'll just kind of leave it at that. Any closing remarks? We'll take questions and/or closing remarks or comments at this time.
Yeah, this is Joshua. I had a question about, I guess, the PPA prioritization. When Max was talking about it, he listed responsiveness, I guess, to surveys as one of the top priorities. And when I look at the Classen corridor, even though it looks like most of these projects are north of 16th Street, which is a wealthier area than south of 16th Street, which is still in that boundary. I'm wondering if surveys are not indicative of need, and there need to be projects in poor neighborhoods where there's more need because they depend on public transit, or they walk, or they cycle as a form of transit, more so than in a more well-to-do neighborhood where maybe people are more likely to do surveys, but also more likely to have vehicles as a transportation.
It's a great question, Josh. Are you done? I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay. That's a very great question. I heard a couple of things there. The main question I heard is, are the surveys not indicative of need? And I think definitely they are indicative of need. I know Max went through the process of showing, the analysis that was done based on responsive populations, which we include that to be also indicative of need. But then we also have to balance that with safety. And so sometimes I think when people ask, they may ask for a facility, but then we also have to take in consideration safety things such as speeds, traffic volumes. Those are really the two key things: speed and traffic volumes. Capacity is the same thing as traffic volume. So sometimes the plan has identified areas or did not identify areas that may should be for need, but because of safety, it didn't balance out. And so we can talk a little bit more about that. I think Classen is a perfect example. We've heard a lot about Classen Corridor and the desire to see it as a bicycle facility. I think the city staff has taken that into consideration, and you will see some things coming along that may not weren't originally included in the plan for Classen, but we have started because of, I guess, community support. We've started working at trying to identify facilities, more bike and pedestrian facilities for Classen, and you'll see more of that coming on board. Did that answer your question, Josh?
It did mostly. I would follow up. I wasn't only interested in the phase 1 on Classen, but also the phase 2, the neighborhood adjoining Classen.
And Josh, this is Kim Cooper. I wanted to, as a matter of clarifying the definition of responsive populations, that's kind of a word of art in planning, and it may not be obvious to anybody else on the call either, that responsive populations is not related to surveys. That's related to demographic conditions where there are people that are exactly what you're talking about. People who may not have access to vehicles, aging populations, people with vulnerable circumstances in their lives. And that's what responsive populations means. And so those PPAs and those projects were, as imperfect as some of them came out, and I think you're raising some really good issues. I want to make sure that everybody here knows that the demographic conditions, to put it all into one term, were a huge part of the consideration in looking at where those projects were located. And it wasn't based on people sending in surveys. I mean, that was a function to identify areas, but if you look at what Max had there, that term responsive populations is not related to people turning in surveys. I just want to make that clear.
Thank you, Kim, sorry. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kim. I'm thinking about Susan. Susan, can we maybe have Jordan go next and then Mr. Cooper, is that okay?
I'll go ahead and ask my question. So thank you guys for that presentation and all the information. When we're giving you ideas about the PPAs, are we primarily looking at infrastructure like sidewalks, crosswalks, or are we also thinking about things like traffic control, like reduction of speed limits, no ride on reds, LPIs, things like that?
Yes, very good question. Also, yes, we would like to receive that as part of your recommendations. I would like to say, just for educational purposes, we do, especially when we're asking for traffic calming measures, there are processes that the city goes through. And so I think similar to Ryan's question earlier, we do propose and recommend amenities, but then there are other factors that come into play. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, Jordan, that may not support our recommendations. But yes, we'd like to look at those. We'd like to look at traffic calming measures and traffic opportunities to help mitigate some of the needs that we have for safe crossings. Thank you, Jordan. All right. And I think Mr. Cooper, Councilmember Cooper, do you have a question?
I have a question and a couple of comments. My question is, when I heard you all describe these possible edits to, expanding, for instance, a PPA or an additional street within a PPA, my understanding is from what we did in maps 4 with the PPAs that we we funded the kind of final implementation of those, but wouldn't too many edits and revisions lead us to a place where those edits are unfunded? And if that is correct, are we kind of starting to eye either matching grant possibilities or looking with that eye, as I heard, I think it was you, Lakeisha, earlier say, the 2027 bond?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mr. Butler, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. We haven't really talked much about the kind of the timeline of the plan. A lot of plans are, a decade out or 2 decades out, and they say but ours is kind of, it's a long range plan. There's no real definitive timeline. In fact, there are a lot of projects in there that we know for a fact are decades out, but we wanted to get them in there so that they're there, so that when development happens, we can accommodate those. In this case, there's a lot of greenway trails, for example. So yeah, if something is a good project, we want to hear about it. The plan, really, the important part is all about prioritization. So we appreciate hearing input as to hey, these projects need to be done, because frankly, we wish we had sidewalks, for example, citywide, but that would be over $1 billion to build those. So it is about prioritization, and that's really what we spend the bulk of our time talking about. So yeah, it doesn't hurt to add projects to the list, and where it gets down to the science is, okay, well, we have to say yes to some and no to others, at least for now. So where does the money go for the foreseeable future? So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, it does. And then a couple other, these are comments just for people listening. I would really encourage you to really think about areas you've heard since you've lived in this city, where residents have always said, well, why not there? Why is there not sidewalks there? An example for me that I've already advocated to planning, so it's going to come as no surprise for them when I say this, is Northwest 30th between Classen and quite frankly I-44. When I was knocking doors, I heard residents time and time again describe students walking in the middle of 30th to get to Northwest Classen, right? And so very early after I took office, that was something I was already mentioning. And even when we funded the PPAs in MAPS 4, I was already saying, yeah, well, Northwest 30th is just outside of this PPA. We need to look at what the possibility of revisions. And so that's what I would encourage everyone on this Zoom call to do, is just kind of think about where are those areas that are just outside of a PPA, but that we know from either our own experience or from our neighbors are kind of asking for that walkability infrastructure or bike infrastructure. The other comment I wanted to make, and it slipped my mind earlier when we were talking about 39th, is to Jeff's earlier point, which is, very, very heavy on my mind since we started looking at 39th last year, was, okay, well, how do I get bike connectivity as it relates to east of 39th Street? And so we're looking at that. We were looking at what does 39th Street between Penn and Classen look like? What does it look like to continue some form of that through the Helm Farm neighborhood connecting to Western? What does Western look like from 39th heading back to the bike infrastructure that we know is going to exist on Classen south of 16th Street? So really thinking about all of these different connectivity possibilities. And again, that's what I would really encourage you all to do on this call is look at where those PPARs, look at where those commercial corridors are, where are those sort of missing connectivity links, and bring those to our attention. That's going to be very, very helpful. Klassen, as you heard earlier, please know that Councilwoman Hammond and I have been advocating for bike infrastructure along the entirety of Klassen in terms of that kind of urban core from Main Street to Northwest Expressway. And that's how we were able to ensure that that southern part of Klassen from 16th South is going to get it. And we know that as the BRT becomes a reality, we have guarantees from the consultants and from the city that anything they do in the implementation of the BRT will not preclude future bike infrastructure on Klassen, particularly as we start working to utilize Western in the interim as that connectivity for bike infrastructure. So I just really want everyone to know that Councilwoman Hammond and I have been speaking to that. And that's largely been the result of, people reaching out to us and or the bike protests that we saw last year. In fact, a year ago this time, Councilwoman Hammond and I were sitting in a room with planning and public works and the BRT consultant having precisely this conversation about Klassen. So yeah, just really think outside the box, everybody, and really look at that in terms of, I think my final note would be, it's just one of my favorite phrases, desire lines, right? Where are those sort of indentions in the grass along the road? Because that's how we know the people in the land are telling us that folk have a desire to walk there. They're going someplace. So keep your eyes open for where those desire lines are as well. So those are it. I just really can't thank staff enough for hearing those residents when we were mentioning stuff like 30th Street, hearing Councilwoman Hammond, and just really letting us revisit this moment with Bike Walk, and I just cannot thank everybody who is a resident who is on this call. It just feels so empowering to hear your voices and hearing the questions that you're asking. This feels very inclusive, and please never hesitate to let me know if it ever feels otherwise. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. I think we'd like to recognize Mr. Littlefield. You're still muted. Let's get you unmuted here.
Did I do that right?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I very much appreciate being invited to this discussion. It's been refreshed me on a lot of things, and it's enlightened me on a lot of things. There are two parts, I believe, that make a community when it comes to transit great. And that's definitely bikes and pedestrians and all the effort that we can put into to accommodate that. But another factor is taking the vehicular traffic and calming it in conjunction with that, especially in particular areas. I've been working on this for years on the Traffic Commission. And there is a traffic calming program that was adopted that's probably been one of the programs in the city of Oklahoma City that's been in its infancy for the longest period of time. I have had, just last week, I visited with James Cooper about getting a set of folks together and getting this traffic calming program off the ground and start implementing the most reasonable things that can make the biggest difference. So that's my comment. I am very enthusiastic about that. Other members of the Traffic Commission are as enthusiastic about it. And I really believe that if that effort could get fuel into it, it would be a great asset to your efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Littlefield. May I suggest that maybe you could review the action plan? I'm asking everybody to review the action plan, but maybe see if there's some way that we can incorporate, if it hasn't already, I know it should be familiar with everything in the action plan, but maybe see if there's something that either needs to be rewritten or restructured in the action plan. And I'm speaking specifically pages, the very last 2 pages of the plan, that maybe we can incorporate some kind of recognition of the traffic calming plan. So we are well past 4 o'clock. I know we were scheduled to end at 4 o'clock. I don't see any additional questions, but I will say we are officially done. If you have any questions of Max or I, please feel free to email us. Our email addresses are in the PowerPoint presentation. Some things to think about. What part of the information that we've discussed so far is something that you might want us to elaborate on? Let us know in advance, and maybe we can incorporate it in our next meeting. If there's a segment of the chapter 3 and 4 that we didn't cover, that's specific to pedestrians right now, we'll try to pick up with bikes again in the future. So if there's something that we didn't cover and you'd like a little more information that you think will be useful for the entire group, please let us know. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and see if he has any closing remarks.
Thanks, Lakeisha. No, I think we're good. I appreciate everybody's time and staff for putting all this together, and we look forward to working with you all to refine this plan and get it ready for the next many years. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. We are adjourned.
Lakeisha, will you be
Yes.
sending out an email like reminder about the homework?
Yes, I did forget to state, expect to receive that by Tuesday or Wednesday at the latest of next week. No later than, but yes, you will get that by email.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, do we need to stop recording?
I think it just stops when we log off. I just want to make sure I farewell everyone who's on to see everyone off.
Lakeisha, there's a button at the very bottom that you can push to stop recording whenever you're ready. Next to the share screen button, do you see it?